All right, let's kick off our deep dive today, and we are taking a look at some financial documents from Seshasayee Paper and Boards Ltd. They are, well, a paper manufacturing company, and they're based in Tamil Nadu, India. And this is really a glimpse into their performance. Hot off the press from January 17th, 2025, covering the quarter and 9 months leading up to December 31st, 2024.
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting. This isn't just some sort of internal report. This is like a full-on regulatory filing
Mm.
that was sent to the National Stock Exchange of India
Mm.
and BSE Limited,
Mm.
which essentially are like India's version of the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
And I think that level of formality really highlights how important transparency is,
Yeah.
for these publicly traded companies.
Absolutely. And I mean, especially when you think about the detail in this document, I mean, even the board meeting to
Yeah, it really does suggest a degree of seriousness around these results. Maybe some complex issues they needed to unpack, or maybe some disagreements even. What do you think, listener? Does that extended meeting time make you a bit more curious about what's actually in the report?
It definitely does, and especially considering we're talking about unaudited financials here. So I'm curious, what areas do you think might be most subject to change when the final audited report comes out?
That's a really great question. A lot of times areas like revenue recognition
Mm.
or asset valuation can be adjusted during the auditing process. So we might see some shifts in those figures once Surrey and Co., the chartered accountants, complete their full review.
Okay, so let's dive into maybe some of the highlights here. The company's total income for the quarter was a pretty hefty 451.89 crore, and their net profit for the quarter came in at 16.63 crore. How do those numbers strike you in comparison to, previous periods?
Well, it's kind of tough to say without looking at the trends Is this growth? Is it decline? I think remembering context is really key. When we are analyzing financials, for instance, like the concept of year-over-year growth, really helps us understand if the company is truly performing well or if these figures are actually maybe a little bit of a cause for concern.
Yeah, one detail that really jumped out at me was the acquisition of assets from another paper company, Lakshmi Paper Limited. Now they were in liquidation, which means
Yeah, essentially that means
okay.
they're being shut down and selling off their assets to pay off debts. So it sounds like Seshasayee Paper saw a bit of a strategic opportunity here.
Yeah, but there's a bit of a legal wrinkle here. The document does mention these ongoing appeals against the National Company Law Tribunal's order. So this acquisition isn't exactly a done deal just yet.
Exactly, and that adds another layer of complexity. If they can successfully navigate these legal hurdles, this acquisition could significantly change Seshasayee's market position. But if those appeals succeed, they might be forced to walk away. It's a little bit of a gamble, wouldn't you say?
For sure, for sure. And it does, lead to a bigger question. How does this bold move fit into, the larger picture of the paper industry, both in India and globally?
Yeah, that's a really key point. The report states that paper is the only reportable segment of operation of the company, which means their entire business hinges on the paper market. Now, while paper is certainly essential, you have to kind of wonder if relying solely on one product makes them vulnerable in today's kind of rapidly evolving market.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially with trends like, digitalization, increasing environmental awareness. You would think diversification would be a smart move. It really makes me wonder about their long-term strategy. What do you think, listener? Would you be concerned about this lack of diversification if you were considering investing in this company?
It's definitely something to think about. Now, on a different note, I did notice
Yeah.
the limited review reports from Surrey and Co., chartered accountants.
Right. And, these reports are essentially a stamp of approval from, financial experts. They're there to ensure the numbers are accurate. And in line with accounting standards, it's, reassuring to see their involvement, especially with the added security of those unique document identification numbers, or as we call them, UDNs, which, really do help prevent forgery.
Absolutely. Those UDNs highlight how seriously they take the integrity of these financial reports. But I am curious, knowing these statements haven't been through the full auditing process yet, what do you think, Surrey and Co. might be scrutinizing most closely in their limited review? What potential red flags would you be looking for if you were in their shoes?
Well, I think I'd be curious about things like how they're valuing the assets acquired from Lakshmi, especially given the ongoing legal challenges. I'd also want to take a closer look at, their revenue recognition practices, making sure everything is above board. Would you agree, listener? What other areas would you be scrutinizing if you were part of that auditing team? I think as we dig deeper into these financials, it's really striking how Seshasayee Paper and Boards Limited, it's not just about numbers. There's a narrative kind of unfolding here, especially, when they talk about the Sarvalakshmi paper acquisition.
Yeah, it's like they're breathing new life into a struggling company. Remember how they use that phrase as a going concern?
Mhm.
I mean, that tells us, they intend to actually revive it, refurbish it, and recommence operations, not just strip the company for parts.
Yeah, it's a much more interesting story than just, a simple asset grab. It speaks to a certain level of ambition and perhaps even a sense of responsibility towards Sarvalakshmi's employees and stakeholders.
Yeah, agreed. Although it's not all rosy, they do mention those appeals challenging,
Hmm.
the acquisition. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, business decisions can face, significant hurdles. It kind of makes you wonder what kind of, internal debates and risk assessments went into this decision.
It does add an element of suspense, doesn't it? And speaking of numbers, those crore figures are still swirling in my head. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and we're just looking at one quarter. If we kind of extrapolate that to the entire year, the scale of their operations becomes even more impressive.
Right. So where does all this income come from? I mean, is it all from selling paper?
Well, while paper is their primary business,
Yeah.
they also have, other income,
Yeah.
which totaled 20.56 crore this quarter. This could be anything from, interest on investments to income generated by maybe subsidiary businesses. It's always a good sign, to see multiple revenue streams, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It adds a little bit of buffer against fluctuations in the paper market. So now on the other side of the equation are the expenses: cost of materials consumed, purchase of stock in trade, employee benefits expense. I mean, there's a lot going on here.
Right. And remember, every business has costs associated with running their operations. The key is to kind of analyze how these costs are distributed.
Mhm.
For example, the cost of materials consumed at 278.60 crore for the quarter indicates, the significant reliance on raw materials. For paper production,
Right. And cost of power and fuel coming in at 60.49 crore. I mean, that highlights how energy intensive this manufacturing process is. It really gives you a new perspective on the paper industry. There's a lot more to it than just trees and paper mills.
right, and those costs are subject to fluctuations too. What happens if, energy prices spike? It's something to consider when evaluating the company's vulnerability to those, external factors. Then you have like finance costs at 1.81 crore, which is essentially the interest they're paying on loans. Investors always keep a keen eye on this figure.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it? Each piece of information kind of helps us understand the company's inner workings.
Precisely. We're not just looking at raw data, right? We're trying to understand the story behind the numbers,
Mhm.
the strategic decisions, the potential risks and rewards. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so engaging.
Yeah, speaking of which, I've noticed how this report provides some insight into Seshasayee Paper and Boards Limited's history. Just look at, their paid-up equity share capital. And those reserves, these figures really speak volumes about their financial strength and stability over time.
Absolutely. And remember, these are unaudited figures. The final audited report might paint an even more impressive picture. It makes you wonder how these figures compare to their industry peers. Are they outperforming the market? Are they lagging behind? That kind of comparative analysis can be really insightful.
It's a good reminder that these numbers don't exist in a vacuum.
Huh.
And speaking of key indicators, what about earnings per share? That seems like, a pretty important metric for investors.
It is. Earnings per share essentially tells you how much profit the company is generating for each share outstanding. It's a way to gauge profitability on a per-share basis, which helps investors compare different companies.
So a higher earnings per share generally means the company's doing well.
Generally, yes. It suggests that they are effectively converting their revenue into profit for shareholders. But of course, you always have to consider the broader context, such as industry trends and the company's growth potential.
Right, right. Earlier we were talking about the auditors, Surrey and Co. And I'm still a little bit curious about what their limited review actually entails. I mean, do they go through every single transaction?
Well, not in the same depth as a full audit, but their limited review does involve inquiries, analytical procedures, and risk assessments to ensure that the financial statements are plausible. So they're looking for any red flags or inconsistencies that warrant further investigation.
So it's kind of like a spot check, but a very thorough one to maintain the integrity of the report. But how do they choose what to focus on? What are the criteria they use to decide which areas they need to scrutinize more closely?
That's a really good question. I imagine they use, their professional judgment and expertise, taking into account factors like, the company's industry, its history, any recent changes in its operations, and of course, any areas highlighted as potentially risky, in the unaudited statements, for example, given this whole acquisition, and the legal challenges. I wouldn't be surprised if they took an especially close look at how Seshasayee's valuing those acquired assets.
Yeah, that makes sense. After all, they are ultimately responsible for providing assurance to investors that these financial statements are reliable.
Exactly. And their presence adds a layer of credibility that wouldn't exist otherwise. It allows investors to have more confidence in the information they are using to make decisions.
This deep dive has been fascinating so far. It's made me realize that financial reports are more than just numbers. They're stories about companies, about their strategies, and their place in the world.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a reminder that with a little effort, anyone can learn to decipher these reports and glean these valuable insights.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, listener, what's standing out to you the most so far? What aspects of Seshasayee's story are you finding most compelling?
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of Seshasayee Paper and Boards Ltd. We've covered a lot of ground, from analyzing their financial performance to, understanding their strategic decisions.
Yeah, it has been quite the journey, hasn't it? And I think along the way we've highlighted something really crucial, the importance of transparency and accountability in corporate reporting.
Oh, absolutely. From those detailed board meeting minutes to those, independent auditor reports, it's clear that Seshasayee Paper and Boards Ltd.
Right.
Wants to be, upfront with investors and stakeholders, and it's refreshing to see.
Definitely. Transparency builds trust. And trust is, essential in the world of finance. I mean, after all, investors are entrusting their hard-earned money to these companies.
That's right. And speaking of investors, let's maybe revisit that thought-provoking question we posed earlier. If you were an investor armed with all this information, what would you do? Would you buy, sell, or hold Seshasayee Paper and Boards Ltd. stock?
It's a tough call, isn't it? There's no, one-size-fits-all answer. Some investors might be really excited by the potential of the Sarvalakshmi acquisition and see it as a sign of growth.
Right. While others might be concerned about, those legal challenges surrounding the acquisition, or the company's reliance on a single product in a changing market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of this deep dive, right? We're not telling you what to think. We're giving you the tools and the information to form your own conclusions.
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to, your individual investment goals, your risk tolerance, and your overall market outlook. Do your own research, weigh the pros and cons, and, make a decision that aligns with your investment philosophy.
It's a bit like being a detective, isn't it? Gathering clues, piecing together the evidence, and forming your own hypothesis.
And just like in a good detective story, sometimes the most intriguing questions are the ones left unanswered.
So what do you think the future holds? For Seshasayee Paper and Boards Ltd., listener, will they overcome the legal hurdles and successfully integrate Sarvalakshmi Paper? Will they diversify their product portfolio to adapt to those evolving market trends?
Those are the questions we leave you to ponder. And remember, the world of finance is constantly evolving, and staying informed is key. Keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper, and never stop learning.
We hope this deep dive has been both enlightening and empowering. Until next time, keep those curious minds engaged.